This is KTVO's Good Morning Heartland.
And welcome back. New dietary guidelines officially endorsed by the U.S. government were just released, and they were immediately greeted with criticism. Today we have Dr. Justin Puckett with Complete Family Medicine here this morning to discuss these new guidelines and what you need to know. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you.
So first of all, go ahead and kind of just recap these new guidelines that we can expect.
Yeah, so the two groups that have kind of came together are actually, they're in the same family. So the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services are the people who put out our dietary guidelines. And those are the guidelines that are going to drive everything from school lunches to certain other government food stamp programs and those sorts of things. And so they have applicability to a lot of folks. And so these two groups the first group is an advisory committee, the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, and that's a group of doctors, PhDs, researchers that get together, and then they hammer everything out, look at all the research, and come up with their report to the government, and then the government takes that report and then rolls out these guidelines. And so the guidelines this year are a little bit different. They're focused more on dietary patterns instead of on certain specific items. So they say instead of avoiding certain items, say that have sugar in them, they just recommend that we have less than 10% of our caloric intake coming from added sugar. And so those two groups, the folks that provided the advisory committee guidelines, feel like the government really didn't address a lot of the issues that they came up with in their research and in their studies, and that's kind of where that controversies came to head.
Now, why is it that they decided to do it this way as opposed to avoiding these types of food? Instead, you should do this. Why did they decide to do that? To me, I feel like that's a little bit more confusing.
Yeah, so it's a matter of speculation, but clearly there's a strong consensus that we know that in Washington that there's a certain amount of input from outside forces that affect government agencies, and one of those, the sugar sweetened beverage industry is huge. The beef industry is huge, and so and then just thinking about general processed foods, that is a huge industry. And so the government was, according to the folks in the advisory committee who went on the record, have been more concerned that, hey, instead of just saying we need to avoid sugar sweetened beverages, we've kind of talked more about the sugar and left the sugar sweetened beverage thing aside. And instead of talking about that we need to have lean meats, and so we need to be eating lean beef and a variety of proteins, we talked about this saturated fat thing. So there's been some advances. We've brought eggs back in. Eggs were out. Eggs are back in as a good protein source, and things are kind of bouncing around. But that's really kind of where that hits, where those folks have kind of been button heads, is more focused on who's influencing the government, and why are we using these euphemisms to talk about things in our diet? Why can't we just say what we mean?
Yeah.
And I think you're right, it has made it a bit more confusing.
Okay, now since we kind of have a little better understanding of the new guidelines, what does that mean for people in the heartland?
Well, I think it means no greater than, according to the guidelines, no greater than 10% of your calories in a day's time should come from added sugar. So sugars that are in things like apples and any fruit is going to come with its own anecdote, the fiber in that item, and that's going to help make that glycemic index lower. So those sugars, the natural sugars, don't count, although I think that certainly too much of that can be a problem as well. But added sugars less than 10%, saturated fats less than 10% in the day, and then using a variety of protein sources, so bouncing around between lean red meat, poultry, fish, other seafood items, shrimp, all of that is a good thing for us to do. No trans fats, so trans fats should be entirely out of our diet, and mostly that's been done in things that we're getting commercially, those are the primary guidelines. And then the report did mention just briefly that exercise is an important part of what we do as well.
All right, now let's go ahead and talk about some, take-home bullets. What should we take away from this and keep in mind the next time we go grocery shopping?
Sure. Well, one thing that's a little bit different that we've learned lately relative to how we eat is that inflammation is the problem. We have heart attacks because of inflammation. We get cancer because of inflammation. Inflammation is really the thing that we want to avoid. And whenever we eat the same food items day after day after day, oftentimes our body begins to build up an inflammatory, not an allergic, but an inflammatory response. And so it's actually better to rotate things on like an every 4 or 5 day rotation. So you can still have your leftovers, just make sure they're going to be okay in 4 days, or eat them that same day. But we want to put those food items into a rotation to help avoid the inflammatory response that you can have. There's actually some advanced testing that can be done to find out exactly what your intolerances are and the foods that you should avoid, either altogether or firmly put on a rotation plan. And there's some things that are probably okay to have on a daily basis, things like coffee and water and some of the other more benign foods. But even simple things that we would think of as some fruits and vegetables are actually better to be eaten on a rotation. And then making sure that you're including fish in your diet is huge. That's one thing that we just don't do enough of. And ideally omega-3 containing fish. So that's pretty much going to be, when it comes to freshwater, the only thing is trout. And then outside of that, we're talking about tunas and salmon and mackerel. Those are the big fish, oil fish, or using a fish oil supplement. And then just making sure that we're staying active and trying to eat a variety of foods, whole foods, avoiding anything processed. Anytime you can get something that you have to put together, make, or do yourself, or something that you can eat in its raw form, that's going to be better than something that you open up out of a box.
And we also put up here on the screen, use a logging device to ensure accuracy. Is that kind of like a food diary?
Yeah. My favorite is MyFitnessPal. It's a free app that you can use. You can even go friend your doctor and opt to share your information with them. One of the other dietary guidelines that we didn't mention, because it's more about micronutrient, is sodium. And sodium is one of the things that I tell patients, you need to have, we've been saying, less than 2,300, less than 3 grams of sodium in a day's time. And that is very difficult to get a handle of. But if you use a standardized application like MyFitnessPal, even when you're eating out, nearly every restaurant that is of a corporate nature is going to have all of the nutritional facts for everything. So if you plug in a Big Mac, it's going to tell you how many grams of sodium are there. And then it's hard to just, okay, well, what do I do for breakfast? What do I do for lunch? So having some sort of a way to kind of do that for you, just to spot check yourself. It's not something that you necessarily need to do every day, but sometimes the two things whenever I have people do food diaries that really surprise them is their sodium intake and the lack of fiber. And those are two things that are really key. We need to get around 30 grams of fiber a day, and then we need to let go of the sodium. So using salt substitutes are a great way to do that. As long as you don't have problems with your kidneys, talk to your doctor before you do that. But those are some great options, ways that you can really stay on top of what you're doing.
Okay, perfect. So what we'll do is we'll post everything on our website at ktvo.com. We'll link up all the information as well, and we'll link up information with Dr. Puckett at Complete Family Medicine if they have any questions or concerns. Again, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be right back.